Right, thank you very much. Am I unmuted? Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay, well, thanks very much for the invitation to talk. It's greatly appreciated. I'm here all day, and I'm looking forward very much to hearing the other talks as well. I'm Dr. David Omissi. I'm a professional historian with a long history of working and publishing on the history of the Indian Army. I've worked particularly on the Indian Army and the First World War. If you want to get in touch with me, my email address is up there. As Tom said, I'm currently writing a book for Cambridge University Press about the Indian Army and the Second World War. So I've moved forward a bit in time then, and the book will go up to, crucially, up to 1947 and will include the partition of the undivided Indian Army. Today's paper will draw on some of the highlights of the book, and I've particularly drawn out some of the stuff with particular reference to Burma. I will be talking quite a lot about the nature of the Indian Army, the background to the Indian Army in the Second World War, and in particular I'll be talking about how the Indian Army was transformed during the course of the war. It's very much a story of transformation in a multitude of ways. First and most notably, of course, of defeat in Burma in 1941-42, into victory with the reconquest or reoccupation of Rangoon in 1945, May 1945. It's also a transformation in the nature of the army, nature of the Indian Army. The Indian Army in 1939 was a small colonial force. It was transformed into, by 1945, into a 2 million strong war-winning army. Well, what I'm arguing in the book and what I'll be highlighting today as well is this story of transformation is not just a transformation of the Indian Army, it is a transformation of the wider political relationship between Britain and India itself. It's a transformation of the British-Indian imperial relationship, and we can see this at work in the way in which the Indian Army was changed over this time. It's also the story, I think, of a forgotten army. We see this, you can see that phrase in the exhibition. I've just had a quick look round it. Beyond Burma, the term forgotten army is applied there. Forgotten army was a term that was used at the time, and it was used subsequently. And so I'm going to end my talk. I'll talk about Burma, I'll talk about the immediate aftermath of the war, but I'll also end with some reflections about how and why the Indian Army has been remembered or forgotten in both India and in Britain. Now, I want to start with a small mention of the significance of Burma, just to remind us of why Burma was important. Burma's location was crucial. It was the kind of defensive buffer to eastern India. But of course, in the context of China's war with Japan, Burma was crucial because of the Burma Road. The Burma Road running from Rangoon through Mandalay into Kunming and Chongqing in China was carrying supplies for China's war effort by rail, then by road into China. And the Japanese were at odds with Britain about the existence of this Burma Road. They managed to get it closed briefly in 1940. The Japanese were expected to attack the Burma Road after they'd established bases in French Indochina in 1940 to 41. And you can see on your map there both the route of the road and the expected directions of the Japanese attack, which would go from the north of what is now Vietnam, or French Indochina, to cut the road. In fact, the Japanese attack, when it came from southern Burma. It came from an unexpected direction from Malaya, after the Japanese had occupied Malaya in 1941 to 42. So I want to start with the whole idea of defeat, which helps to establish the sort of the basis for this discussion of defeat into victory. This is a map of the Japanese conquest of Burma. The Indian Army was defeated in Burma in 1941-42, partly because the Japanese had superior air power. Also, the Japanese proved themselves to be better at jungle fighting. They'd established that in Malaya in 1941-42. And on your map there, you can see the progress of the Japanese invasion. It starts at the very southern tip of Burma. They move their way up, taking Rangoon on the 8th of March in southern Burma, thus cutting the main port for the Burma Road. Moving on to take Mandalay in the centre on 30th of April. Akyab in the Arakan. We'll hear a bit more about both of those on the 4th of May. And then Myitkyina in the north on the 8th of May. You can see that the pace of the Japanese advance was fairly slow at first and then very rapid once they'd reached Mandalay. So defeat, 1941-42. This was followed by a further defeat for the Allies when they attempted to take the offensive in the Arakan on the Burmese coast in 1942-43. The first Arakan offensive ended in a heavy defeat with heavy casualties from malaria. So one of the questions then we need to address was how was this beaten army transformed into the war-winning army that recaptured Rangoon in 1945. And one aspect of that transformation was numbers. The Indian Army was hugely expanded between 1939 and 1945. The Indian Army, the figure I've given there for 1st September 1939 is of all Indian other ranks, not including reserves or British officers. And you can see there's a rapid expansion in numbers, and the crucial 2 million mark was breached in early 1943. This pattern was slightly uneven. In 1939, the Indian government offered troops to help with the war in Europe against Germany. They were told there would be no need. The war simply would be confined to Europe. This all changed, of course, with the fall of France in May-June 1940 and the entry of Italy into the war in June 1940. And you see a rapid expansion then of the Indian Army from 1940 onwards, reaching its ceiling, not complete ceiling, but reaching at this figure of 2 million by early 1943. Winston Churchill, Prime Minister and Minister of Defence, had generally an attitude of hostility to the Indian Army, probably stemming from his experiences in India in the 1890s. And he took an intermittent interest in India in the war, and he was certainly very agitated when he discovered that the Indian Army had passed the 2 million mark in 1943. And when he learned that the Indian troops were receiving modern weapons, one of the first questions he rather petulantly asked was, will their guns be pointing the right way? In other words, would they be turning on their British officers or not? Now, the story of numbers in the Indian Army is not just a story of more troops, it's also a story of different troops, that the Indian Army actually changed its ethnic makeup to an extent during the course of the war. And you can see there a map of India, and what I've done is I've put on the right-hand side there something about the proportions of troops enlisting in the Indian Army, or the Indian Armed Forces more generally, from September 1939 to, I think the figures are to December 1944. Now, the traditional recruiting grounds of the Indian Army had been Punjab in the northwest. That had supplied up to half the troops to the Indian Army up to 1939. Punjab still remained an important recruiting ground. 25.5% of all recruits came from Punjab during the war. The single most important ethnicity or ethno-religious group for the Indian Army in both world wars were the Punjabi Muslims, recruited in now Pakistan. Of course, the famous Gurkhas had also been important. But what was happening during the Second World War was the base of recruiting for the Indian Army was broadening. And you can see that other areas of India were also becoming significant. In particular, Madras, which had been seen as no longer a home of warlike Indians, began to be recruited more heavily, and 18% of all recruits to the Indian Defence Services were coming from South India. This was broadening the recruiting base of the Indian Army more generally, and it was also making the Indian Army more national in its makeup. Instead of being recruited from this narrow range of martial races, by 1944-45, the Indian Army it's not a completely national army, but it is more national in its makeup. Now, crucial to all of this was the Commander-in-Chief of the Indian Army, Claude Auchinleck. He was very much an Indian general. You can see he was commissioned in an Indian regiment, the 62nd Punjabis, in 1904. He served with his Indian battalion in the First World War, and he had a number of Indian appointments after that. But notably, he was Commander-in-Chief in 41 and again 43 to 47. The slide shows to the left there an edition of his papers that's just come out, well, a few years ago, from the National Army, from the Army Records Society. Now, crucially, he raised, in broadening the recruiting base of the Indian Army, he raised new regiments, or he revived old regiments like the Madras Regiment, trying to broaden the recruiting base of the Indian Army by region and by ethnicity and caste. Auchinleck also favoured increasing the proportion of Indian officers with the King's Commission, with the power of command over Indian and British troops. He dramatically increased this proportion of Indian officers. The total of Indian officers with the King's Commission, or something like it, went from a few hundred in 1939 to several thousand by 1945. The Indian Army's command was being nationalised as the rank and file were being nationalised during the war, although the highest rank attained by an Indian by 1945 was brigadier. And this process of Indianisation of the officer corps didn't affect the famous regiments of Gurkhas, which retained all their British officers, and I'll say more about them later. Now, this nationalisation of the officer corps was bound to change the post-war colonial relationship. The army of 1939 was very largely dominated by British officers. The army of 1945 had thousands of Indian officers. And Auchinleck, in this regard, can be seen as something of an Indian nationalist, in that he favoured move gradually towards self-government in India and the nationalisation of the army. Indianisation was also happening on the Burma front, in Southeast Asia Command as well, by proportion, that the proportion of Indian troops was increasing. If we look at the total of Southeast Asia Command's land forces in 1945, Britain and the Commonwealth between them provided about 606,000. Of those, the Indian Army provided 82%. The war in Burma then was very much an Indian Army war, at least on the British Commonwealth front. The rest of the troops were African, British, Chinese, in that order. Now, partly, of course, this reflected the fact that the British Army was suffering from a manpower shortage in the later stages of the war. Northwest Europe was becoming the major priority, particularly after the landings in Normandy in June 1944. Burma was fairly low down the British Army's list of priorities. Even the British Army in India was slightly under. British Army in Italy was slightly under strength, because Northwest Europe and France were given the priority. Indianisation was also happening at a brigade level, not just in terms of overall numbers, not just in terms of command, but if you actually look at individual brigades, you can see that these are being Indianised in terms of the numbers of regiments. After the 1857 mutiny, when the Bengal Army turned its weapons on its British officers, then of the East India Company, of course, after that, as a precaution, British and Indian troops had generally been mixed in India in roughly the proportion of 2 Indians to 1 British, a much higher proportion of British troops than had been hitherto the case before 1857. And this happened not just over on a sort of global level in India, but also at a brigade level. The ideal Indian Army brigade, according to Churchill, and also according to others, notably the India Committee of 1943, the ideal Indian brigade would have 1 British battalion, 1 Gurkha battalion, and 1 Indian battalion. The Gurkhas, of course, being recruited outside India from Nepal. Over the course of the war, particularly in the war's later stages, there was a shift towards all India brigades, which incidentally William Slim, the commander of the 14th Army, preferred. There were also all Gurkha brigades, and some Indian Army divisions were also almost completely Gurkha divisions. What this meant was that the Indian Army was effectively at a divisional and brigade level, again, effectively its formations were being nationalised by 1945. So transformation then in terms of numbers, in terms of command, and in terms of proportions of troops, all of which have significant political implications. Transformation, of course, was taking place also in terms of training and doctrine. What was happening during the war was that the Indian Army wasn't simply expanding, it wasn't becoming a colonial infantry army, but simply being greatly expanded to fight a world war. It was also being adapted for modern warfare in several respects: doctrine, equipment, and in particular army-air relations. If we talk about doctrine for a moment, after the defeats in Malaya and Burma, an infantry committee was set up in June 1943 to consider retraining the Indian Army to make it more effective, particularly against the Japanese, and more effective especially in terms of jungle warfare. And the jungle warfare doctrine that emerged was codified in September 1943 in this military training pamphlet number 9. India, the 4th edition appeared in September 1943, and it was colloquially known as the Jungle Book. And of course the image of the Japanese soldier being squeezed by an Indian Army fist there with good training. You can see that actually in the display beyond Burma upstairs. There's a fuller discussion of that in Alan Jeffrey's excellent book, Approach to Battle, about Indian Army training. Now, this doctrine was not just devised, it was disseminated, it was implemented into the front line. Part of the mechanism for implementing this was that 2 Indian divisions, 2 entire divisions, were set aside as training divisions from 1943, providing theatre-specific jungle training for recruits, Indian Army recruits, after they'd undergone their basic training. So jungle training was enormously improved. That was going to be one of the only ways in which the Indian infantry could take on the Japanese on the Assam-Burma front. The Indian Army is also increasing its mechanisation. Again, this happened dramatically after the fall of France, or the idea behind it happened dramatically after the fall of France in 1940. In August 1940, it was announced that all Indian cavalry regiments would be mechanised and would acquire vehicles and tanks. They did so actually somewhat slowly. But Indian armour was present in Burma, although it was only ever used at brigade level. I love this picture. It shows an Indian crew of an American-built Sherman tank with a British commander, and they're passing, of course, an ancient Indian tank in the form of an elephant there on the road to Mike Tiller in March 1945. No complete Indian armoured division was ever used in Burma or in the front line in Burma, Egypt, or Italy. Indian armour was present only at brigade level. The Indian Army received tanks fairly slowly, but it was being mechanised and armoured. probably more important in the Burma context was Army Air relations, and in particular air supply. Army air cooperation and air supply were absolutely crucial to the victory in Burma, as Slim emphasised in his memoirs, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. You can see this image here shows a Dakota, I presume, of the RAF dropping supplies actually to an African division in December 1944. And you can see in the foreground there is a Bofors gun, anti-aircraft gun. There, if you want to see an actual Bofors gun, you can go into the foyer of the museum where there is one. And I can say this is the only talk I've ever given where I've been able to say there is a Bofors gun in the foyer of the museum. I'd forgotten that it was there. Air supply was absolutely crucial in the Burma-India theatre. The supply of the Kohima garrison in 1944, for example, meant the garrison could hold out, as well, of course, flying supplies into neighbouring Imphal. Air supply was crucial to the advances after 1944. If we see in this map of the advance in Burma, in particular, you can see on the coast there the capture of the islands of the air bases at Akab and Ranbury Island. These were captured by 15th Corps in early 1945, January and February respectively, to ensure air supply to the Indian Army as it marched, or to the 14th Army as it marched from Mandalay to Rangoon. Air bases, these bases were captured because they were closer to the route along which the Army would be marching. Air mobility was, of course, also important to the Indian Army. Some of the Indian divisions were converted to light divisions, which included an air mobile brigade, notably the 17th Indian Division, which had 2 mechanised and 1 air mobile brigade by 1945. The most important example of air mobility in Burma was, of course, the famous Chindits under the command of Ord Wingate, killed in an air crash in 1944. The Chindits were a long-range penetration group which fought behind Japanese lines. They were flown in behind Japanese lines and air supplied. I'm not going to talk in detail about the Chindits because I think others will. From an Indian Army point of view, the Chindits are particularly interesting in that Wingate didn't personally rate the Indian regiments of the Indian Army very highly. He wouldn't accept Indian regiments into the Chindits, apart from Gurkhas. Possibly his prejudice may be that Gurkhas retained their full complement of British officers in 1943-44. Air power was also important in terms of close air support, especially from American-built Thunderbolts serving with American and British squadrons, and also, of course, there was some strategic bombing both by American and British units. Air power was also significant in getting troops not just into the battle zone, but also out of the battle zone as well. Air evacuation was crucial in getting the sick and wounded to hospital more quickly. If you think about the terrain in Burma, mountains, jungle, or in the central plain paddy fields, communications were generally very poor. Roads between India and Burma were almost non-existent. Movement by air was one of the quickest and easiest ways of getting the wounded to hospital more quickly. And over the course of the war, the time of evacuation from being wounded to getting to hospital went from weeks to days to hours. And this, of course, was crucially important to the rate of survival. Air evacuation brings us neatly to the subject of medicine in general. The war in Burma was very much a medical war. Victory was being won in a hostile disease environment. Malaria was described as enemy number one in Burma. When Mountbatten was appointed as Supreme Commander Southeast Asia Command in August 1943, he was told that he would find malaria a more significant enemy than the Japanese. And in statistical terms, in terms of hospitalisation, that is actually, in some respects true. And one of the great successes of the 14th Army in this period, 1943 to 45, was in anti-malarial measures. Slim, in his memoirs, emphasises that the war against malaria was not just a question of providing medicine. It was very much also a question of discipline, of making sure that the troops took the mepecrine that they'd been prescribed, and he was prepared to sack officers or commanding units in which the presence of mepecrine could be tested for, and if units showed that the men hadn't been taking their mepecrine as an anti-malarial drug, he would sack officers. There was a drastic reduction in hospitalisation from disease, particularly from malaria, from 1943 to 1945. Although it should be stressed that even in 1945, disease was causing more casualties than enemy action. One of the things I'm trying to look at in my own book, I've got a whole chapter on medicine, the Indian Army medicine in the Second World War. One of the things I'm looking at is the underexplored area of Indian Army mental health. There was statistical mental illness, I think, was statistically significant by 1945. The official history of Indian Army medicine in this period claims that there was more hospitalisation from mental illness than from malaria by 1945. And one of the people I'm going to be looking at in some detail is Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Robert Brocklesby Davis, Bob Davis, a paratrooper, and also a member of the Indian Army Medical Corps. And my medical chapter in the book has looked quite closely at some of the combat stress medical literature, for which the medical periodicals such as the British Medical Journal and so on have proved very useful. And I've been looking at articles written by Brocklesby Davis in, for example, the Indian Journal of Psychiatry, founded in 1949, which had quite a lot about military psychiatry in it. Davis was born in India, in Amritsar, and he became an Indian citizen after independence. I will be talking a bit, of course, about the Indian National Army. Here's a Japanese propaganda poster urging Indians to rise up against Churchill and overthrow British rule in India. The Japanese were able to raise an Indian National Army from Indian prisoners of war and Indian civilians in Southeast Asia. Around 20,000 strong, this force fought in Burma, although the INA, as it was known, had very little military impact, and it wasn't well received by the Indian Army proper. Orders had to be given to treat INA prisoners a little more kindly, as Slim delicately put it in his memoirs. That said, the Indian National Army did have a significant political impact in India after the war, when some of the INA prisoners were put on trial in 1945. Now, as the exhibition upstairs does suggest, the Indian Army's war didn't end suddenly in 1945 with the atomic bombs. The Indian Army's war continued after 1945 in Southeast Asia, hence the title for the exhibition Beyond Burma. The boundary of Southeast Asia Command was extended after the Japanese surrender to include Java. It had already included Sumatra, which had been Japanese occupied, Borneo, and southern French Indochina, roughly what is now Cambodia and southern Vietnam. And the Indian Army's war continued as it was deployed in Southeast Asia, particularly in southern Vietnam and the Netherlands East Indies after the Japanese surrender. There was something then of a post-war war for the Indian Army as the French and Dutch tried to reassert colonial authority in Southeast Asia, and the Indian Army was there to uphold lawful authority, in effect, in some ways, helping to restore colonial authority. My book's going to end with the partition of the Indian Army in August 1947. The Indian Army, of course, was partitioned three ways, not just between India and Pakistan, but also with Britain as well. And Burma, Britain acquired 4 Gurkha regiments in 1947-48, and Burma influenced which Gurkha regiments were to be transferred to the British Army in 1947. There weren't any Gurkha regiments in the British Army before that. And the regiments that were chosen, 3 of the 4, already had battalions stationed in Burma, and Burma was one of the reasons why those regiments were chosen for transfer to the British Army. What about the memory of the Burma War and the whole question of the Forgotten Army? This, of course, has been hugely influenced by the partition of India, and with it the partition of the Indian Army in 1947, and the memory has been very much contested in the post-1947 period. The partition of the Indian Army means that there's no surviving institution which has an institutional commitment to the memory of the undivided Indian Army. The regiments in some ways have survived in India and Pakistan or in the British Army. On the contrary, if anything, politicians and some scholars in independent India have emphasised the role of the Indian National Army in the memory of the Second World War. And Subhas Chandra Bose, a politician behind the INA, Japanese-sponsored INA, has now been officially elevated as a national hero. And you can see him, he's in that, under that canopy there in uniform saluting. That's a statue of Subhas Chandra Bose. The location is really significant. He's in the canopy that previously was occupied by King Emperor George V, and he's now framed by India Gate in New Delhi. India Gate is the memorial it's the All India War Memorial in the First World War, so he's effectively taken on this status of a national hero. So I think India has wanted to play down the memory of the Indian Army, but I think also that's been happening in Britain, and I think Winston Churchill, Prime Minister during the war, has been partly responsible for this. The Indian Army and the war in Burma has been played down in British public memory, and I think in some ways Churchill was personally responsible for this. Churchill possibly deliberately played down the role of the Indian Army in his very influential memoirs, The Second World War, published in 6 volumes between 1948 and 54. He was very quick off the mark, Churchill, and he wanted to make sure that his version of the Second World War became the kind of demi-official version. Churchill played down the role of the Indian Army, and he played up instead the personal role of Wingate and Mountbatten, particularly in volume 5 of his memoirs, Closing the Ring. In that memoir, he emphasised the Quebec Conference of August 1943, conference between the British and American high commands, to which Churchill had invited Wingate and his wife. So he'd invited a fairly low-ranking officer to actually discuss the progress of the war in Burma. In his memoirs, Churchill made a lot of Wingate, and he made a lot of the appointment of Mountbatten as Supreme Commander of Southeast Asia Command, and what was intended to be an amphibious command. The idea was that Rangoon would be liberated by a massive amphibious operation. This never really happened, and there was no explicit reference to the Forgotten Army in Volume 5, in the one chapter, Burma and Beyond, that Churchill devoted to the war in Burma. When the book volume came out, veterans, 1952 I think it was, veterans of the 14th Army complained, and Bill Slim raised the omission personally with Churchill in November 1942. Now, the problem with Slim, of course, from Churchill's point of view, was that Slim was then Chief of the Imperial General Staff. He was about to become Governor-General of Australia, so by then he was way too important to be ignored. I mean, Churchill could ignore Burma, he couldn't ignore Slim. So Volume 6 took a somewhat different line, published in 1954, And this tactfully included a chapter and a half on the Burma campaign of 1945, advance in Burma, and the defeat of Japan. So it's 1.5 chapters on the war in the Far East. And Churchill gave this very positive verdict on Slim and the 14th Army. The famous 14th Army, under the masterly command of General Slim, fought valiantly, overcame all obstacles, and achieved the seemingly impossible. This was prompted by Slim, but it's worth noting that when he does mention the 14th Army, he doesn't mention the fact that it is a majority, 3/4 at least, Indian Army. He doesn't mention the fact that it is Indian. The casual reader could be forgiven for thinking that this was a mainly British army. And this praise for the Indian Army in this part of the memoir is hardly typical of Churchill's memoirs. He mostly ignored the Indian Army or used sleight of hand to indicate that he called it British, or he called Indian divisions British Indian divisions. A very different account emerges in Bill Slim's superb memoir, Defeat into Victory. Slim's memoir of his command of the 14th Army has been acclaimed as the best general's book of the Second World War, and obviously this gives a much more positive and much more accurate, I think, picture of the Indian Army in Burma. And I'd like to end this part of the paper, at least, with Slim's verdict on his troops. My Indian divisions, after 1943, note the date, this is after the establishment of the India Committee, after the Jungle Book, after retraining, were among the best in the world. They would go anywhere, do anything, go on doing it, and could do it on very little. And if you want to know how little they did it on, look at his memoirs. He's very good on the subject of improvisation in a theatre which was not being provided with all the equipment it might have been. Slim's memoir, I think, is a gripping read. I would very strongly recommend it. And I would close also with an image of some further reading, other things other books I'd recommend. Rob Lyman's A War of Empires. I was looking around in the bookshop to see what was available in the bookshop. I do notice Rob Lyman's A War of Empires, Japan, India, Burma, and Britain is available in paperback in the bookshop. Ray Callahan's book there at the top, Triumph at Imphal Kohima. I read it again last week, and I think that is absolutely terrific. Very short summary of the transformation of the Indian Army up to 1944. Dan Marston, Alan Jeffreys, of course, has written extensively. I mentioned the book there, The Indian Army 39 to 47. There's 3 chapters in that which deal with the sorts of issues I've talked about today, including one by Ray Callahan on Churchill and the Indian Army. Dan Marston's book, Phoenix from the Ashes, grew out of his Oxford D.Phil. As I mentioned there, of my book, which is work in progress just about. It's been going on for 5 years now. And Bill Slim's defeat into victory. I'll stop there. That's my 40 minutes up, I think. I can bring back any of those slides if you want me to, and I can bring them back up if you've got any questions about any of that. All right, thanks very much.